I think RWBY has an identity crisis. In a way it always has, but it's never affected an individual volume like this. If you were to binge the entire series, you would get tonal whiplash a lot, but each individual volume was able to maintain some level of consistency. Each volume has had different strengths, weaknesses, goals, and varying degrees of success in achieving those goals. Volume 1 was a quirky web series where Monty and his friends got to show off what they could do with limited resources, but it lacked any narrative throughline. Volume 2 added a narrative throughline. Volume 3 was all about the action. Volume 4 was all about getting the main cast to a point where they're ready to go to Mistral. Volume 5 was supposed to be payback for Volume 3. Volume 6 was a tighter, more standard adventure story similar to Volume 4. Volume 7 put most of its emphasis on the political drama and asked a lot of big questions. Volume 8 was all over the place. Did it want to be a quirky comedy? Did it want to be scary? Did it want to be a better version of Volume 3? Did it want to be a big fireworks display after all the build-up in the prior volume? Did it want to ask big questions? Did it want to be cathartic? Did it want to double down? Did it want to tease romance? Did they intend for Ironwood to be sympathetic in Volume 7, or did they actually make him more interesting than they wanted? Is Salem supposed to be the main threat, or is she still wanting to work through Cinder and the Hound while she continues to bide her time? I really don't know, and I'm not sure the creators do either. How fitting that this identity crisis for the whole show is reflected in its characters. More than any other volume to date, Volume 8 tears all of its characters down and makes them ponder what their role has been. It works with characters like Emerald and Penny. It's completely botched in characters like Nora and Ironwood, and then there's characters like Cinder, who we are left to think learned their lesson, but then just does all the same things she's done before. RWBY Volume 8 is a long volume, and it takes place over the course of a short amount of time. This is by far the shortest time span of any volume, yet the runtime is far longer, and it does a lot more to validate its length than the other volumes. This makes the few minutes where the characters rest and recover stick out. There's a lot of bad faith criticism surrounding Team RWBY's supposed inaction, and they are bad faith criticisms, but they are loosely rooted in the fact that so much is happening all the time, and so the handful of episodes where the characters are in Schnee Manor seem inactive. Even though plenty of stuff happens in the manor, some of it really important, and there's also several other plot threads going on at the exact same time. I try not to let the quality of certain sections take away from the quality of others, and this goes both ways. I still actually like the first 2 episodes of Volume 5, but they're made way worse by the fact Volume 5 did nothing of value with its build-up. Volume 3's final few episodes were fantastic, but in that praise, people often forget how shitty the first few episodes were. The first episode of Volume 8 is pretty awful at setting things up. Most of the volume is fine in the same way that a lot of RWBY is just kinda okay, and the final few episodes are just as solid as Volume 3's finale, but with better build-up. It just doesn't hit as hard. Volume 3 was a dark conclusion to a previously goofy, lighthearted show. Volume 8 is a dark conclusion to a show that had flirted with darkness for a long time now, and has had really dark stuff just a few episodes earlier. I always try to praise Pyrrhic victories because it just appeals to my sensibilities. RWBY petrifying the dragon at the end of Volume 3 and putting an end to Enneagram expansion at the cost of Pyrrha's life in the CCT was right up my alley. Volume 8 also flirts with that by making most of the civilians live and writing a couple characters out pretty gracefully. But Hazel's death, Watts dying, Emerald going through a face turn, and Neo being kicked down so that Volume 9 can have an antagonist was perhaps too much. Penny's death was well executed, and I'm glad some civilians were snatched up by the Grimm, but I can understand why Penny wasn't enough of a loss when compared to with how much the villains lost. This brings me to the action. RWBY has often garnered praise for its action, even though I think a lot of early RWBY fights are overrated and a lot of later RWBY fights are underrated. The action here is certainly serviceable. On first viewing, none of it sticks out as outright bad, like Neo vs. Juniper from Volume 7, or the Cordovan mech fight from Volume 6. But other than the handful of Cinder fights, nothing sticks out as good either. I've always liked the way Cinder fought. She is one of the most powerful characters in the series and fights with a primal energy that makes her completely distinct from the rest of the cast. She gets 3 showcases here, and they're pretty varied. We get a flashback fight that is kinda clunky in its execution and leads to the same muddled narrative content that seems to plague Cinder in this volume. Her fight with Penny atop Amity Arena is one of the cooler fights in the series conceptually, and a massive step up from Cinder's fight with Raven in Volume 5. It's also the only fight this volume that plays around with the idea of different characters having different strengths and weaknesses. So while the choreography isn't very flashy, it still gets my seal of approval. And her final fight is somewhere in between, sometimes sloppy, sometimes brilliant, but very much a moment where the focus is on the plot beats rather than the action, which is what I prefer. It was also nice seeing a Grimm that can kick some ass, and take some of the physically strongest characters and fold them like towels. But its defeat, while leading to an interesting reveal, highlights how unnecessary Silver Eyes are as a power. It only works on Grimm, doesn't have as much of an effect on stronger Grimm, and of course while RWBY has never shown to have full control over those powers, having consistent inconsistency isn't that great of an excuse for not using it more. Speaking of threats, I actually like the Salem fight. I really don't know what people were expecting from an immortal witch whose motivation centers around her wanting to die. Wow, she fights exactly how an immortal witch who wants to die would fight. How surprising. What actually was surprising was RWBY setting a new record for how fast they can ruin a character. Yeah, remember all that depth and nuance and philosophy that made Volume 7 as good as it was? Turns out these writers did that by complete accident and decided to fix what wasn't broken by making Ironwood cartoonish levels of evil. I get him being an antagonist, but he should be the antithesis of trust and compassion. He's the Tin Man without a heart. At his darkest, he should have been someone who is unwilling to trust or aid those who don't directly help him achieve his goals. That's how he was written in Volume 7, and he was the best part of that volume. But no, the Ironwood who held back from killing Watts, trusted RWBY with the relic, and only snapped when he realized these kids would be willing to betray him if they were convinced it was a good thing to do. Yeah, it turns out all of that was a fluke, and that he has a genocidal tendency that rivals Salem. And nowhere in this volume does anyone address that he already evacuated most of Mantle before he even knew Cinder was around. But more of that when I get around to doing an honest look at him. That's the thing about a lot of these identity crisis moments. They seem to work in the moment to build more and more tension leading to the finale. They primarily work to keep the plot moving, and if that were the extent of it, I wouldn't care. The mere act of a story being created means it's going to be contrived, and most real conflicts breed from ignorance and stupidity. So stupid for the sake of plot in a show where none of the characters have been shown to be super intelligent is one of the lamest non-criticisms anyone can ever muster. It only becomes a flaw when it doesn't adhere to the emotional logic of the characters. Nora getting botched isn't dumb because Nora is being dumb. It's dumb because the reason it was botched isn't connected to any trait Nora has ever shown. Same thing with Ironwood. If he were just acting dumb or scared, it would be fine. It's the fact he's going against everything he ever stood for in prior volumes that ruins his character. I like to assess these volumes in a vacuum, but they do not actually exist in a vacuum. Nothing fully exists in a vacuum. There is always going to be context. And in the end, Volume 8 was as flawed and fun as pretty much any other volume of RWBY, only this time it flirted with some of the highest highs the series has achieved. And other times it felt like they were self-sabotaging and undoing every good thing they did for the last two volumes. I give it a 6 out of 10, but that's because, as hype as this was, there was way too many things that were complete disappointments. I'm Mediocrity4, thanks for watching.